Thank you, Emil, and thank you, New York Public Library, for inviting me to present this talk. And I especially want to thank Aliona of the Tompkins Square Library and Emil from the Hudson Park Library, who have worked so hard to make this happen. They are a dream team. I love working with them. Okay, so until a few years ago, my knowledge of land art was limited to Robert Smithson's iconic spiral jetty, created in 1970 on the shore of Utah's Great Salt Lake. Adding to its allure, it lay hidden underwater for nearly 3 decades, submerged shortly after completion and only emerging in 2002. Then I read Erin Hogan's 2008 book, Spiral Jetty, the title a pun, as she visited these earthworks in her VW Jetta. I learned about double negative, sun tunnels, and the lightning field. And I vowed that one day I too would visit these works. And I did in June 2017. This talk, as Emil said, is inspired by that trip, truly an adventure. In addition to my photos, I am presenting images found through my research. My aim is to trace the trajectory of both the movement and the careers of these particular 4 artists: Michael Heizer, Robert Smithson, Nancy Holt, and Walter D. Maria. Next. Next slide, please. Sometime in the 1950s, Georgia O'Keeffe said that the Southwest is, quote, not a country of light on things. It is a country of things in light. This statement perfectly posits one of the main concerns of these artists: how objects, whether natural or man-made, and our perception of them changes over the course of a day as the sun rises, moves across the sky, and sets. Next, please. Their other concern was isolation, to situate their work far from urban centers and museums, which they declared were, quote, artificial and senseless. Abandoning their studios in the late 1960s, these 4 artists struck out for remote parts of the American Southwest, seeking those hard to get to desolate areas that might embody Walter D. Maria's maxim, quote, the land is not a setting for the work, but a part of the work. Working on location, they used the earth both as sculptural material and canvas, creating earthworks. These artists were obsessive in their desire to carve out their existential relationship with planet Earth. Ronnie Sassoon, who produced the revelatory documentary Troublemakers, the story of land art, has said, they were idealistic. They were also dogmatic. They were doing it according to their own imagination and belief systems, and what they saw as an authentic environment. To communicate the existence of their art, because, hey, who could get there? They depended on photography and the mass media. When I told local residents the purpose of my trip, I usually got blank or puzzled looks. Either they were unaware of this art or they dismissed it. With a few exceptions, the era of monumental works lasted only a decade, the 1970s. In the 1980s, a broader definition of land art emerged and included the work of Christo and Jean-Claude, Charles Simons, Richard Long, Anna Mendieta, and later Andy Goldsworthy, Maya Lin, and many others. Next. So, this solo female traveler of a certain age flies to El Paso and picks up her rental Nissan SUV. Although the model was unnervingly called Rogue, it served me well. Over the course of 1 month, I logged 4,566 miles, driving through glorious, if harsh terrain and over bone-jarring, stony roads that often prevented speeds of more than 10 miles per hour. El Paso was the jumping off point for Marfa and the world of Donald Judd. I then backtracked and proceeded clockwise to Sedona for some hiking, Overton for Double Negative, Lucin for Sun Tunnels, Roselle Point for Spiral Jetty, Quemado for the Lightning Field, and finally ending up in Abiquiu in the world of Georgia O'Keeffe. Next. Robert Smithson, like the others, was disillusioned with the New York gallery scene. And in the February 1967 issue of Arts magazine, he wrote that the experience of visiting museums was stale and obsolete. This drawing accompanied his article, Some Void Thoughts on Museums, and is based on his favorite cemetery, Flower Hill in North Bergen, in his native New Jersey, and visited on long walks with his wife, Nancy Holt. Having experienced and rejected abstract expressionism and pop art, the artists were now pushing the boundaries of conceptual art and minimalism. The latter rather ironic considering the monumentality and great costs of their most well-known work. Many of these artists gravitated to Cornell University's architecture and arts programs. In 1969, the seminal exhibition Earth Art opened at Cornell, the first institutional venue for land art in the United States. A true reflection of 1960s counterculture, the show aimed to deny the commodity status of the art object and, again, ironically, to question the role of institutions. Next. Site-specific installations by 9 artists were installed in the A.D. White Museum and scattered around the Cornell campus and the surrounding Ithaca area. Here are 2 works from the show. Smithson, born in 1938, was already working on his series Sites, Non-Sites. Paired work using natural and man-made elements created both indoors and for a gallery. This piece is related to one sited in a local quarry. Dennis Oppenheim on the right was a pioneer, not only of earthworks, but also body art and conceptual art. Described as, quote, an environmentally inclined Marcel Duchamp, he too was born in 1938. Gordon Matta Clark, who died too young at age 35 in 1978, was one of Oppenheim's student assistants and helped construct the Beebe Lake Ice Channel. This spring, we'll see David Hammond's Day's End, an homage to Matta Clark's unauthorized 1975 intervention of the same name. Cutting 5 holes into the walls and ceiling of the abandoned building on the now dismantled Pier 52 across from the new Whitney Museum, Matta Clark transformed a hub of gay cruising into, quote, a sun and water temple. Next. Michael Heizer and Walter Di Maria were originally part of the Cornell exhibition. Their work, although made, was, for some reason I really don't know, not shown. Heizer dug a large pit in the garden of the museum. Okay. Di Maria, who had an impish sense of humor, filled a room with dirt, perhaps from Heizer's pit, and on a surface spelled out good fuck. As we shall see, the ideas of dirt and pits played important roles in their careers. Both artists had previously worked in California and Nevada deserts. For his drawing at El Mirage Dry Lake, Heizer rode his motorcycle in circles on the desert floor, leaving geometrically precise tracks. Next. Their drawings have been compared to the mysterious Nazca lines and figures etched into Peru's southern desert. Next. In the United States, their equivalent is the petroglyphs and petroglyphs created by Native American nations as early as 500 AD. Next. Born in 1944, Michael Heizer is the only one of the four still alive. He is without doubt a child of the West. His father was an archaeological anthropologist who taught at Berkeley. His paternal grandfather was the lead geologist for the state of California. His mother came from a Nevada tungsten mining family. It's no wonder that rocks and digging have been leitmotifs throughout his career. 6 tons of earth were displaced from a dry lake bed to create isolated mass circumflex, the last of his 9 Nevada depressions made around the state. Foreshadowing double negative, the 1-foot wide trench extends 120 feet from end to end, forming at the center a circular loop 12 feet in diameter. Like the displacement drawing, no traces remain. Next. Of double negative, located on Mormon Mesa in Overton, Nevada, 80 miles northeast of Las Vegas, Heizer famously said, "There is nothing there, yet it is still a sculpture." Using dynamite and a bulldozer to excavate 240,000 tons of desert sandstone, Heizer created 2 long, straight trenches, each 30 feet wide and 50 feet deep. The cuts face each other across a natural canyon, a bridge connecting 2 voids. Extending 1,500 feet from end to end, the trenches are long enough to hold the Empire State Building lying on its side. Next. This photographic collage shows the section of Mormon Mesa where double negative is sited. The map indicates the route to double negative. It looks pretty straightforward, but it is not. There are no obvious markers or roads off the truck route that traverses the mesa. Next. I was understandably reluctant to explore Mormon Mesa on my own, as a few days earlier, I was stranded overnight on Brins Mesa in Sedona, Arizona. The path circling the top of the mesa is not connected to the path leading down to the trailhead. Well, my quite fabulous night on the mesa and very welcome rescue the next day, when I lucked into cell phone service on a flip phone, no less, is another story. Over a drink. Anyway, back in Sedona, I wrote to the Overton Chamber of Commerce hoping to hire a guide. A few days later, chamber member Mary Kay Washburn called me, offering to drive me up. So this is the road leading out of Overton, and here we are on the mesa looking back down. Next. The clearest of the available text directions states, if you reach the far edge of the mesa, you've gone too far. Despite Mary Kay's many trips to double negative, we never saw the cattle grid and missed the left turn indicated on the map. So we ended up at the mesa's far edge. We turned around and headed north, tracking across the mesa. Next. Quite soon we came upon Polish Negative, a satirical response to Heizer's work and a geocache or letterbox site. Next. Finally, one of our tasks brought us to Double Negative's Southern Trench. The entire work encompasses 60 acres of land purchased for Heizer by gallerist Virginia Dwan, whom the New York Times dubbed, quote, the legendary dealer, the grande dame of the avant-garde. An heiress to the 3M company, she also helped finance Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Heizer has said that Double Negative is really a kind of scar, an intrusion of nature, an assault of some sort. And I wonder if that's why I was unmoved by it. However, to be fair, my reaction stems from an incomplete experience. On my own, I would have climbed down into the trenches and walked from one to the other, crossing the natural canyon that divides the two. Also, I would have spent several hours there, experiencing the coolness of the earth out of the hot desert sun, marveling at the layers of time exposed by the deteriorating trenches and tracking the progress of the day by the movement of the shadows across the walls. It's very possible that being inside Double Negative, I would have shared Aaron Hogan's experience of it as, quote, a vehicle for both the sublime and the intimate. Next. In 1984, Dwan donated Double Negative to the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. When announcing the gift, LACMA said it would not undertake any conservation measures of the piece, and that Heizer wanted nature to eventually reclaim the land through weather and erosion. However, in 2005, he talked about returning to Double Negative and carving out its sides to their original perpendicular perfection. 2020 marked the work's 50th anniversary, and this, fortunately to my mind, has yet to happen. Heizer's quest for permanence is completely opposite to Smithson's fascination with entropy, to be discussed later, and his concerns are opposite to those of Nancy Holt, who, unlike most of her male colleagues, brought a human dimension to her work, always considering and respecting a site's history, geology, and identity. Next. Heizer is now in his late 70s, recognizable by his weathered face and 10-gallon hat. Since the completion of Double Negative, he's been working on the immense city, which the New York Times called, quote, a kind of modern Chichen Itza. Its forms also draw from indigenous North American mounds and the local landscape. 1.25 mile long by 1/4 mile wide, city is about the size of the mall in Washington, D.C. Unlike Double Negative, it's been built to last forever. Next. To enter the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, visitors walk through a 456-foot long concrete trench. Above it is a 21.5-foot tall boulder weighing 340 tons and said to be 900 million years old. Getting the boulder to the museum from its source, the Jurupa Mountains Quarry, 105 miles away, required a flatbed with 200 wheels. The trip, documented in a fascinating film available on Amazon Prime, passed through 22 cities to avoid 2 low freeway overpasses and took 10 days. Alas, the supporting shelves destroy Heizer's original idea of a floating stone, which gave the work its name, levitated mass. Next. From Overton, I traveled north and east through the Great Basin Desert to Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels, 4 18-foot concrete culverts, sited to align with the rising and setting of the sun on the winter and summer solstices. I arrived on June 13th. One of the few women artists to gain recognition in the male-dominated land art scene of the 1970s, Holt was born in 1938 in Massachusetts, but spent her childhood in Smithson's, New Jersey. She began her career writing and making photographs, films, and videos. She was interested in how our perception of objects in cities, nature, and the cosmos changes over durational time and from many points of view. Next. In her 1967 photo montage, Concrete Visions, Holt played with the ideas she explored in her later work: the framing of space, the passage of time, a remote location, and industrial materials. In 1969, she began work on her steel pipe T-shaped locators, first installing them in her apartment on windowsills and the floor. Blotting out surrounding features, they directed viewers' sight to a specific location, in the landscape perhaps, or to a mirror, so the viewer sees oneself viewing. They were for her, quote, the way to everything I've done since. Next. The interior Holes of Light is a rectangular room with a central partition wall perforated with circular shapes. The alternating lights on the side walls project changing patterns on the opposite wall. Mirrors of Light utilizes circular mirrors and rays of light to examine the laws of reflection. Both works required rigorous calculations. Along with the locators, they concern the complexity of perception, focus, light, and space. Next. The 1974 Hydra's head was inspired by the Native American saying, "Pools of water are the eyes of the earth." It was set along the Niagara River in Lewiston, New York. 6 cylinders sunk to a depth of 3 feet were filled with water and arranged in the same configuration as the upper part of the constellation Hydra, the mythical water serpent. The different diameters of the pools correspond to the size of the stars, each becoming a mirror for catching and reflecting their light. Next. In 1963, Holt married Robert Smithson. On their first trip out west, she fell in love with the land, saying it transformed her life as an artist. Together, they bought a small property in Utah. In 1974, a year after Smithson's tragic death at age 35, she bought more land, paying $1,600 for 40 acres, gorgeous acres, in Box Elder County within Utah's Great Basin Desert. There she set about creating sun tunnels. Okay, so the printed directions to sun tunnels seem pretty straightforward. Interstate 80 to Route 30, exit at Lucin, today an abandoned railroad community, and look for signposts at specified distances. Alas, these signposts never showed up. Just as I was beginning to despair I might be lost, I saw this sign at the bottom. Next. The specified train tracks ultimately appeared almost 2 miles further than indicated, and it would have been easy to miss the sign at the bottom, hardly in the best condition, at this very critical turn. Then again, both Holt and Smithson were averse to any signage in the landscape to direct visitors. The journey in finding their works was part of the process. And actually, I have to agree. Next. 40 minutes from the highway, the last two turns appeared as promised in the directions. Then in the far distance, and you can see it kind of at the horizon line in the center of the slide, I could just make out the four culverts that make up Sun Tunnels. They are situated in the closed Bonneville Basin that runs north to south and is surrounded by Lion, Little Pigeon, and Pigeon Mountains. Next. The 18-foot tubes, each having a 9-foot diameter and weighing 22 tons, form a cross with an open center, each pointing to one of the four cardinal directions. To create Sun Tunnels, Holt required the help of 2 engineers, 1 astrophysicist, 1 astronomer, 1 surveyor, and his assistant, 1 road grader, 2 dump truck operators, 1 carpenter, 3 ditch diggers, 1 concrete mixing operator, 1 concrete foreman, 10 concrete pipe company workers, 2 core drillers, 4 truck drivers, 1 crane operator, 1 rigger, 2 cameramen, 2 soundmen, 1 helicopter pilot, and 4 photography lab workers. Next. Here you can see some of the complex calculations involved. Next. I arrived late afternoon after a long yet beautiful drive through Nevada's desert and ghost towns. Soon the light began to color the sky, the land, and the tunnels. I was not alone. A mother and daughter had also set up a tent. We shared some tequila and watched the sun set. We were just a week from the summer solstice, so its trajectory pretty much led to the culvert center. That night, our tents were surrounded by a dozen wild horses. Next. My new friends left after breakfast, and I spent the day communing with this most evocative work of art. Between the journey to the Sun Tunnels and spending about 40 hours there, I began to feel part of the work, metaphorically and certainly literally. During the heat of the day, the tunnels were a cool, sheltering place to hang out. Next. As you can see, each tube is perforated with holes, taking the shape of specific constellations. Capricorn in the western tube, Columba in the south, Draco in the east, and Perseus in the north. Connecting earth and sky, sunlight streams through the holes, their size relative to the star's magnitude in the sky, projecting the constellations on the tunnel's interior and allowing us to walk on stars. Their positions change throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky, and in moonlight, the holes become circles of light emulating the constellations. For Holt, sun tunnels aim to indicate the cyclical time of the solar year and, quote, to bring the vast space of the desert and the immensity of the cosmos to human scale. Here, there is the feeling of being at the center of the universe. I was in the middle of nowhere, yet it seemed I was in the middle of everywhere. Next. For me, Sun Tunnels is a very feminine work. Perhaps it's the circles, unlike the sharp points on top of the lightning field's 400 poles. And it is this softness and Holt's concern for the land, rather than the aggressiveness of the works of some of her male colleagues that, until recently, resulted in the comparative lack of recognition afforded her career. Holt died in 2014. In March 2018, Dia Art Foundation took ownership of Sun Tunnels in a purchase gift arrangement with the Holt Smithson Foundation. The headline in the New York Times announcement ran, quote, Dia acquires Sun Tunnels, its first piece of land art by a woman. I find the gender qualifier rather insulting. The acquisition also included Holes of Light. Next. Some of Holt's work, like Pipeline, have a strong political and environmental message. Invited to Alaska to be inspired by the landscape, Holt was aghast at the leaks in the pipeline and the effect of oil spills on the pristine environment. Pipeline was part outdoors, part indoors. One segment of the pipe arches over a railroad track and then plunges into the ground, forming an archway that people walk under to enter the museum. The pipe then climbs up the side of the building and seems to pierce it. Inside, the pipe turns a few times, slowly making its way downward. Like the actual Alaska pipeline, it is propped by braces, and it's here, regulated by a timer, that the oil leaks into a pool. Next. Up and Under explores both spatial orientation and the interrelationship of sky and earth. It also functions as a community gathering place. Aligned with the North Star, it has 7 horizontal tunnels, 4 running east-west and 3 running north-south. A vertical tunnel soars into the sky, bringing clouds, stars, and the moon down to the earth and into one's perception. Next. Robert Smithson's iconic spiral jetty on the northeastern shore of Utah's Great Salt Lake is just 9 miles from Golden Spike National Historic Site, a bumpy 30-minute ride over stony roads that cut through privately owned land. Commemorating the 1869 completion of the First Continental Railroad, it was authorized in 1957, but it wasn't until 1978 that the site's master plan was adopted. So what was very remote in 1970 is almost like a theme park today. Next. Celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2020, Spiral Jetty juts out into the lake's pink salt waters at Roselle Point. Smithson chose this site after hearing that the water was the color of tomato soup. Its red hue the result of a peculiar combination of algae and organic chemicals. A well-regarded theoretical and critical writer, Smithson described the lake in florid prose. I closed my eyes and the sun burned crimson through the lids. I opened them and the Great Salt Lake was bleeding scarlet streaks. My sight was saturated by the color of red algae, circulating in the heart of the lake, pumping into ruby currents. My eyes became combustion chambers, churning orbs of blood, blazing by the light of the sun. The path of the jetty, composed of basalt rock, salt crystals, and mud, is 15 feet wide and extends 1,500 feet. The spiral itself is 50 feet across. In 1972, 2 years after its creation, the jetty disappeared underwater. More than normal rains and runoff from mountain snow had caused the lake to rise. Then, years of drought caused the lake to recede, revealing in 2002 a spiral jetty whose black rock was crusted over with accumulations of blindingly white salt crystals. And that's what we see here. Next. Earlier in his career, Smithson created Asphalt Rundown, one of his poor pieces. Here, a dump truck pulled up to an abandoned gravel pit and released wet concrete, further disrupting a landscape already scarred by the displacement of millions of tons of soil. Two versions of chalk mirror displacement belong to Smithson's Site Non-Site series. This piece is related to those he would create for the 1969 show at Cornell, Earth Art. Next. Smithson was long fascinated by spirals. In the late 1960s, he visited the 1,400-long pre-Columbian Serpent Mound in Ohio. It, in part, inspired Spiral Jetty. Next. Smithson was religious, and spirals showed up in many of his early paintings. I first gave this talk in Paris, and a few days before, I visited the 12th century Basilica of Sainte Marie Madeleine in Vézelay. To my delight, the guidebook directed my eye to the two spirals in this image of the Pentecost, located in the central portal of the narthex. It is thought that the spirals signify the spiritual combat between the forces of good and evil. The spiral at Jesus' right hip moves outward, representing God's good grace. The inward moving spiral in his knee represents evil. Next. To create Spiral Jetty, Smithson was assisted by a crew operating two dump trucks, a large tractor, and a front-end loader to move 6,650 tons of rock and earth from the adjacent shore to form the coil. Next. Work began in April 1970. It turns out that Spiral Jetty was constructed twice. The first effort, which looked like an upside-down J, took 6 days. After contemplating the result for 2 days, Smithson called back the crew and had the shape altered to its present configuration, an effort that took 3 additional days. Next. I was prepared for the small size of Spiral Jetty, but I expected it to look like a jetty, a solid rock structure, as it mostly was in 1970 above. The rocks I saw were few and far between. Smithson once said, quote, "I like landscapes that suggest prehistory. The changing landscape, water levels, and the salinity of the lake reflect his complete embrace of the concept of entropy, the inevitable and steady deterioration of a system, as articulated by the second law of thermodynamics." Next. Smithson envisioned his artworks, quote, "in a state of constant transformation, whose form is never fixed and undergoes decay from the moment of its creation." Next. I also expected to see a spiral jetty encrusted in white crystals. Reports spoke of this in 2002, when the waters receded, revealing the work after its 30-year submersion. When Aaron Hogan, who wrote Spiral Jetty, visited it in 2008, the jetty was entirely white. Next. Instead, this is what I saw: more sand than rock and only remnants of salt crystals. Several flocks of pelicans flew overhead. According to February 2017 reports, the lake had receded at approximately 500 feet, a point of some concern. However, after a winter of plentiful rain and mountain runoff, the lake, which wasn't particularly pink that day, gently lapped against the outer ring of the spiral. I took off my boots and waded out as far as I could. Closer to shore, I tasted the salt crystals from the flats. I spent 2 hours there from noon to 2 p.m., a time of day when there's no real play of light on the jetty, the water, and the surrounding mountains. Still, it was beautiful. Yes, Spiral Jetty has inevitably changed, as Smithson knew it would, even if he couldn't predict just what those changes would be. Next. In 1999, Nancy Holt donated Spiral Jetty to the Dia Art Foundation, and in early 2017, Utah's House and Senate voted to designate Spiral Jetty as an official state work of art. Next. In 1971, Smithson traveled to the Netherlands to create Broken Circle Spiral Hill. Located in a sand quarry on a lake, it harks back to his early work in New Jersey and Ithaca quarries. Broken Circle combines a jetty with the canal and has a boulder in its center. Spiral Hill was originally composed of black dirt with white sand. Pass. Since 1972, it's been carpeted with cotton Easter, a dense green plant. Broken Circle Spiral is centrifugal or outward. The path of Spiral Hill is centripetal or inward. I think back to the Christ and Majesty at Vesely and the battle between good and evil. The family that owns the property continues to maintain the work to this day. Next. Smithson died in 1973 in a plane crash while inspecting the land for his new work 17 miles from Amarillo, Texas, an arid landscape scorched by the sun 350 days of the year. Amarillo Ramp was completed by his widow, Nancy Holt, along with sculptor Richard Serra and gallerist Tony Chavrasi, who suggested the site. Rising from an artificial lake, the work aimed to combine a utilitarian irrigation operation with an artistic act to beautify the landscape. The lake, however, has since dried up and been abandoned, leaving the work overgrown and eroded. Entropy for sure. Next. In 2005, Nancy Holt helped realize Smithson's Floating Island, a project imagined back in 1970. According to Holt, the 30 by 90-foot barge landscape with earth, rocks, native trees, and shrubs was intended as an homage to Central Park. For a week that September, a tugboat toted around the island of Manhattan. From the Charles Street Pier in the West Village, which can be seen in the image at lower right, I watched it proceed up the Hudson River. Next. This is what everyone hopes to see when visiting Walter D. Maria's The Lightning Field. 400 highly polished stainless steel poles with solid pointed tips and laid in a grid 1 kilometer by 1 mile. Thunderstorms are more common but not guaranteed in July and August, rather than in May, June, September, and October, the 6 months it is open to the public. Next. Di Maria was born in 1935. He died in 2013. His artistic roots lie in the Fluxus movement and poetic happenings in San Francisco. And he played the drums with Lou Reed in The Primitive, the precursor to the Velvet Underground. In 1960, Di Maria moved to New York City, and in 1980 settled into a former Con Ed substation in the East Village. There he took advantage of its gigantic interior spaces to create his sculptures. If Di Maria did indulge in pornography himself, number 11 on this list, we should recall his censored piece for the Cornell Earth Art Show, that pile of dirt with the words "good fuck" on the top. And he did walk the desert, number 8. Next. In 1968, a year before the Earth Art Show, Di Maria traveled to the Mojave Desert and created the mile-long drawing. 2 parallel lines, 4 inches wide and 12 feet apart, that, drawn with chalk, extended for 1 mile. The next year, he and Michael Heizer created their pieces in El Mirage Dry Lake. Desert Cross consisted of 2 intersecting lines of white chalk that extended 500 feet in one direction and 1,000 feet in the other. Disappearing into their desert landscapes, washed and blown away by wind and rain, these works focused attention on the concepts of measurement, order, space, the ephemerality of time, and the nature of memory. Next. These are the precepts that Di Maria laid out for the lightning field. And as we shall see, every one of them was experienced during my visit. Next. Only 6 people can visit the lightning field at any given time, and it includes a night's stay. At 2 p.m. on June 22nd, the day after the summer solstice, we 5 converged in Quemado, New Mexico, at the headquarters of Dia Art Foundation, which funded and oversees the work. Here we met Robert Weathers, Lightning Field's caretaker. As a young man, he led the group of teens who installed the poles from June through October 1977. Next. We piled into Robert's van, and after a 40-minute ride traveling northeast into the desert of west central New Mexico, we arrived at the lightning field and the reconstructed homesteader's cabin where we would spend the night. After settling into the cabin's 3 bedrooms, checking out the dinner and breakfast items left for us, and making the first of many batches of margaritas, we started exploring the lightning field. Next. Here are some facts, although as Di Maria stated, quote, "their sum does not constitute the work or determine its aesthetics." Di Maria combined an aerial survey with computer analysis to determine the positioning of the grid and the elevation of the terrain. What he learned from a test site created in 1974 determined the number of poles and their distance from each other. The 400 poles have varying heights, ranging from 15 to 26.5 feet, depending upon the surface of the ground. The idea is that the tips would evenly support an imaginary sheet of glass. Just one example of Di Maria's precept: the land is not the setting for the work, but a part of the work. Next. Each mile-long row contains 25 poles spaced 200 feet apart and runs east-west. Each kilometer-long row contains 16 poles, also spaced 200 feet apart and runs north-south. The diagonal distance between any 2 poles is 311 feet. If laid end to end, the poles would extend 1.5 miles. Their total weight is approximately 38,000 pounds. While a simple walk around the pole's perimeter takes approximately 2 hours, we pretty much wandered through them until sunset. As Di Maria stated, and it was true as you can see from these photographs, that during the mid portion of the day, 70 to 90% of the poles become virtually invisible due to the high angle of the sun. Yet, as he also stated, the invisible is real. Next. With the lowering of the sun, the poles are merged in their glory. How true were Di Maria's words. No photograph can completely represent the lightning field. In fact, we were asked not to take photos, but of course we did, even though we realized that cameras can be barriers to directly experiencing the effect of light on the poles. The sunset itself was not particularly spectacular, although at its end, only the tips of the poles remained visible, a bit otherworldly and actually quite lovely. The night sky, however, was glorious, illuminated by millions of stars and a new moon. Going outdoors at 3 a.m., I disturbed a small white owl, which flew out from under the eaves, as surprising as it was thrilling. Sunrise, though, was another story. The poles seemed to dance as the sun rose and moved across the sky, section after section becoming visible. Next. It was a real treat spending an afternoon, night, and morning at the lightning field. Next. Yet I did not have the same visceral response I felt at Sun Tunnels. This had nothing to do with the lack of lightning, perhaps because it was such a controlled experience and very male, all those tall poles and sharp points. But I am very happy I went. Next. At precisely 11 a.m., Robert reappeared to return us to Quemado. After a lunch together, we five went our separate ways. Next. Di Maria once said, I think to be a true minimalist, you should almost nearly be invisible yourself. This might explain the very few photographs of him. And here he required the trusting mind of the viewer with the very subtle and nearly invisible vertical Earth kilometer. At the intersection of the two paths crossing the park, one comes across a red sandstone square with a small opening at its center. Flush with the ground is the flat circular top, 2 inches in diameter, of a 1 kilometer long brass rod that's been inserted into the ground. Passing through 6 geological layers, the boring of the shaft took 79 days. The rod itself is made up of 6 lengths, each 548 feet that are tightly screwed together. Next. On Worcester Street in New York City's Soho neighborhood, a discrete sign at door level is the only indication of what lies within, the New York Earth Room. Visitors ring a doorbell and after being buzzed in, climb 2 flights of stairs. The air is heavy with pungent dampness. At the top is a room filled with 250 cubic yards of loamy soil that's 22 inches deep and weighs 280,000 pounds. That's 140 tons. De Maria described the New York Earth Room as, quote, a minimal horizontal interior earth sculpture, leaving viewers to supply their own meaning. Bill Dilworth, the long-term caretaker who weekly waters, weeds, and rakes it, used even fewer words than Di Maria. He said, it's art, it's earth, it's quiet, and it's time. Next. 3 blocks away, in a ground floor space on West Broadway, Di Maria arranged 500 polished brass rods in perfect rows, the spacing between each row decreasing by a few millimeters as they recede from view. If placed end to end, the rods would extend 1 kilometer. Broken Kilometer is spectacular in scale and visually dazzling. The rods appear as the rippling surface of a golden pool of water that stretches to the horizon. Every 2 years, staff assess the settling of the building floorboards, propping up individual rods to ensure they remain level, like Lightning Field, Vertical Earth Kilometer, and the New York Earth Room. Broken Kilometer was funded and is maintained by Dia Art Foundation. Next. Now 83, Charles Ross is in his 4th decade of working on star access, a celestial observatory near Las Vegas, New Mexico, about 80 miles southeast of Santa Fe. Not far away, and working with Virginia Dwan, who funded both Heizer and Smithson's work, Ross created the Dwan Light Sanctuary, a place of peace and contemplation. 24 large-scale prisms are suspended at precise angles on the ceiling and in the apse. Dictated by Ross's complex calculations and aligned with the sun, they project massive rainbows in dramatic patterns and colors that radically change throughout the day and the seasons. Next. With star access, Ross is mapping time by embodying the astronomical phenomenon called precession, the top-like wobble of the Earth's axis due to the sun's gravitational pull on the slightly bulging equator. Polaris, or the North Star in the constellation Ursa Minor, is currently the closest bright star to the northern celestial pole. But in time, other bright stars from other constellations will become the pole star. The entire cycle takes 26,000 years. To chart this, Ross has built a 130-foot tall, 11-story observatory. The curved 30-foot tall limestone entry walls were constructed using Roman building techniques, and a 147-step passageway climbs to the observatory. Next. At the bottom of the stairs, the stars come into view, framed by an oculus 40 inches wide, but from here seems the size of a dime held at arm's length. Here too, the sky is seen as it is today, or actually will be, around 2100, when Polaris and the pole itself will be perfectly aligned. With each step, the field of vision widens, moving through precession's 26,000-year cycle. At the top, the most distant past and future orbits of the pole star can be seen. The sky as it was in 11,000 BC and as it will be in AD 15,000. Next. Since 1977, James Turrell, now 77, has worked on Roden Crater in the Painted Desert region of northeast Flagstaff, Arizona. He is transforming a massive extinct crater into a celestial theater, complete with sound and sculptural elements for the contemplation of light, time, and landscape. He has moved 1.3 million cubic yards of earth just to shape the crater bowl. When complete and open to the public, perhaps in 2024, its cost is expected to be upwards of $200 million. Next. Roden Crater will contain 6 tunnels and 21 viewing spaces. Turrell's approach is scientific and rigorous. The sun, sky, constellation, and cloud movements can be tracked minute by minute, and once every 18.61 years, the moon will be in direct alignment with one of its central Tunnels. Next. I'll end this talk by returning to Walter D. Maria's words about any effort to describe his art, and by extension, land art. The sum of the facts does not constitute the work or determine its aesthetics. Basically, you've got to be there and experience for yourself the isolation and the light. Still, I hope you've enjoyed sharing my journey, and armed with some facts, you can appreciate the originality and beauty of these works and the artists who created them. Thank you.